Benito Juarez was Mexico's first and to date only indigenous president. He is one of only two presidents whose term was cut short by death. The other president was Carranza. Benito Juarez is particularly renowned for his role in drafting the Constitution of 1857, which significantly curtailed the power of the Catholic Church and the military. He is also remembered for his resistance against Emperor Maximilian during the French intervention in Mexico. Many cities, neighborhoods, and streets throughout Mexico bear his name, and Mexico City's International Airport is named in his honor. Benito Juarez and Abraham Lincoln were contemporaries, but they never had the opportunity to meet in person. Now, some historians have pointed out some intriguing similarities between the two. Both emerged from humble beginnings. Lincoln and Juarez were trained as lawyers and rose to prominence during a turbulent period in their respective countries. Lincoln ensured the preservation of the Union during the US Civil War. Benito Juarez safeguarded the Mexican Republic during the French intervention. Now, this is a statue of Benito Juarez in Washington, D.C. And this is a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Mexico City. Abraham Lincoln and Benito Juarez never met or corresponded directly. However, their contributions shaped the future of North America, and in the 1960s, the presidents of the United States and Mexico exchanged statues of their predecessors. And I've included a link in the description box of the full text, but here's an excerpt from President Lyndon Johnson's remarks at the dedication of the Abraham Lincoln statue in Mexico City in April 1966. All nations highly praise their own famous men, but only a truly great people pause to pay tribute to the great of other lands. And that is what Mexico is doing today. What Abraham Lincoln stood for is what binds our two nations and indeed this entire hemisphere together. Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, but by 1850 the nation appeared to be on the brink of complete collapse, suffering from 30 years of violent conflict between two political factions, the conservatives and the liberals. Now, this prolonged conflict resulted in a bankrupt treasury and a demoralized population. Now, similar conflicts between conservatives and liberals unfolded in various Latin American nations. Essentially, two political parties emerged, each representing divergent views on how the newly independent country should be governed and how it could best achieve economic and social development. Now, in the 19th century, Mexican conservatives portrayed themselves as defenders of colonial Spanish values while supporting the nation's economic development. Even after gaining independence from Spain, they wanted to preserve the power and privileges of the Catholic Church and the military. Now, during the colonial era, the church and the military enjoyed special legal rights known as fueros, and these privileges protected the clergy and soldiers from civil court judicial procedures regardless of the offense. They operated under their legal systems which were separate from those of ordinary citizens. And under the banner of Religión y Fueros, conservatives defined the church and the military as the guardians of the newly independent nation. Ordained clergy and military personnel retained exemptions from trial in civil courts and certain tax obligations. Ultimately, Mexican conservatives aspired to transform Mexico into a highly centralized state rooted in the institutions and ideologies of the colonial period. Now, understanding the concept of fueros is essential to grasp the anti-clerical sentiment of Mexico's liberal reform movement, in which Benito Juarez played a significant role. Now let's talk about Mexican liberalism. Liberalism in Mexico must be explained within the broader political trends of the 19th century, which sought to challenge established power structures in Europe and the Americas. Latin American liberals regarded themselves as progressives in contrast to conservatives. Their primary objective was to establish a secular state and ensure equality of all individuals before the law. Liberals aimed to abolish the fueros held by the Catholic Church and the military, and thereby eliminating their separate legal systems. Mexican liberals envisioned a secular Mexico with a dynamic economy like the United States. They perceived the fueros and conservative ideologies as obstacles to the country's political, social, and economic advancement. And unlike conservatives who preferred the Catholic Church to oversee education, liberals advocated secular public education. Now, typically, liberals represented the interests of small merchants, intellectuals, political leaders in rural regions, and small ranchers from the South and West. They considered land distribution as a crucial strategy to diminish the power of the Catholic Church and to integrate indigenous peoples into the new Mexican nation as citizens. Liberals wanted a federal system and a constitutional democracy based on the ideals of Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson. However, unlike liberals in other parts of the world, 19th century Mexican liberals did not call for limitations on executive power. Now let's review the early life and political career of Benito Juárez. He was born on March 21, 1806 in a small village in the state of Oaxaca. And Juárez's birthday is now celebrated as a public holiday in Mexico on the third Monday of March. He was the son of poor Zapotec peasants who passed away when he was just 3 years old. And Benito lived with his grandparents and an uncle until the age of 13. He then moved to Oaxaca City to join his sister, who worked there as a maid. In Oaxaca City, Benito Juárez learned to speak, read, and write Spanish. And in the city, he found work with a bookbinder named Don Antonio Salanueva, who later became his godfather. He graduated from the seminary in Santa Cruz in 1827, and though Salanueva encouraged him to pursue a path to the priesthood, Juárez chose to enroll at the Oaxaca Institute of Arts and Sciences to study law. And in 1831, at the age of 25, he earned his law degree. Over the next 15 years, he became involved with the Liberal Party and served as a city councilman and a state legislator. Juárez frequently represented impoverished indigenous communities in their efforts to protect their land rights, quickly establishing himself as one of Oaxaca's leading lawyers. Between 1836 and 1846, conservatives held a dominant position in Mexican politics. In 1841, Juárez was appointed federal court judge by the state government. He married Margarita Maza, the daughter of one of Oaxaca's wealthiest Creole families. And Juárez also served as secretary to the state's conservative governor. His commitment to liberal principles was evident when he resigned from the judgeship rather than prosecute individuals who refused to pay clerical tithes. However, the state government soon reinstated him, and in 1846 the Liberal Party, led by the former President Valentin Gomez Farias, took power. And at this juncture, Juarez transitioned from provincial to national politics, becoming one of Oaxaca's 10 deputies in the national legislature. He also served on the congressional committee that crafted the controversial law in January 1847, which aimed to finance the war with the United States. This law authorized the government to raise 15 million pesos by mortgaging or selling church property. Now, as you all know, Mexico lost a significant amount of territory to the United States during the Mexican-American War, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo established the Rio Grande as the official border between the two countries. Now, following the war, the liberals blamed the conservatives, leading to an even more unstable political situation in Mexico. And between 1848 and 1850, the country experienced a rapid turnover of leadership with 7 presidents and 10 ministers of foreign affairs in just 2 years. Clearly, there was a lack of strong governance. In 1853, a fragile coalition invited exiled General Santa Anna to take control of the Mexican government. Because Santa Anna was a distinguished war hero and an experienced politician, he was granted sweeping powers in hopes of unifying the nation. However, he exercised dictatorial power and exiled many of the liberal political opponents, including Benito Juarez. Juarez first lived in Havana before relocating to New Orleans. Now, unfortunately, Santa Anna led the country into deeper bankruptcy and political chaos. Disgruntled liberals led by Juan Alvarez called for the removal of Santa Anna, and this liberal call for a nationwide revolt against Santa Anna in 1854 is called the Plan of Ayutla. Juarez returned to Mexico to join this effort to overthrow Santa Anna, and the Plan of Ayutla was a written document issued from Ayutla in the southern state of Guerrero, which was not under the control of Santa Anna. The liberals were angered by Santa Anna's pro-Spanish policies, such as hiring Spanish mercenaries and confiscation of public lands in Guerrero. Now, the Plan of Ayutla condemned Santa Anna for the Gadsden Purchase, in which he sold the Mesilla Valley to the United States for $10 million in 1853, and his dismantling of representative government. Now, this plan also called for a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. Santa Anna's government fell with minimal resistance. There were no major battles, and Santa Anna abdicated on August 12, 1855, and fled into exile. On November 14, 1855, Juan Alvarez assumed the presidency and appointed Benito Juarez as his Minister of Justice. The new liberal government heralded an era known as La Reforma. Juarez began to implement his reform ideas, which focused on promoting individual rights, curtailing the power and influence of the Catholic Church in secular matters, and placing the military under civilian control. He exiled the Archbishop of Mexico, 5 bishops, and the Spanish ambassador, all of whom had supported the conservatives. The liberals enacted a series of controversial reforms during the mid-19th century. In 1855, they introduced Ley Juarez, which abolished the fueros or special exemptions previously granted to the church and military. This law eliminated the jurisdiction of church and military courts over civil cases. The following year, in 1856, Minister of Finance Miguel Lerdo de Tejada sponsored the Ley Lerdo, which mandated that the church sell any land it owned that was not utilized for religious purposes. The government wanted to generate revenue through taxes on these land sales. Additionally, this law prohibited the church from acquiring land in the future. In 1857, a further reform known as Ley Iglesias was implemented, which regulated the fees that priests could charge for services to the poor. Under this law, baptisms, marriages, and funerals for the poor were provided free of charge, effectively transforming marriage into a civil act rather than a sacred one. The government also introduced various new holidays to commemorate national events while reducing the number of religious holidays observed. The reform laws established the separation of church and state, promoted the secularization of schools and charities, and enshrined the freedom of religion, speech, and the press. Collectively, these changes were incorporated into the Constitution that was ratified in 1857. The Church, of course, did not acquiesce to these restrictions, and numerous religious Mexicans opposed the secularization of civil life. This led to a civil war known as Guerra de Reforma, or Reform War, that lasted 3 years from 1858 to 1861. The conservatives emerged victorious in the initial battles, forcing the liberals to abandon Mexico City. The conservatives established their government and began drafting a new constitution. At this time, Juarez held the position of the Chief Justice of the Mexican Supreme Court. However, the conservatives imprisoned Juarez for his defense of the 1857 Constitution. Juarez managed to escape prison and fled to Guanajuato. The liberals established a rival government in Veracruz. Several states in northern and central Mexico supported the liberals. During these turbulent times, Juarez became the undisputed leader of the Liberal Party. Meanwhile, the conservatives repealed the reform laws and dispatched their troops northward to eliminate liberal resistance, prompting Juarez to seek refuge in Veracruz. For the next 3 years, Juarez and the liberals maintained control of Veracruz while the conservatives held sway over Mexico City. The church supported the conservatives through funding, troops, and moral persuasion. In 1859, the liberals responded by enacting stringent anti-clerical laws that confiscated church property without compensation. That same year, Melchor Ocampo signed the notorious McLean-Ocampo Treaty, which aimed to cede additional portions of Mexico to the United States in exchange for urgently needed funds to continue the war. However, this treaty was ultimately rejected by the US Senate, and in 1861 the Reform War ended and the liberals gradually turned the tide in their favor. Liberals successfully re-established their control in Mexico City. Juarez was elected president in March 1861, and although the Civil War had ended, Juarez's government continued to face significant challenges. The country was on the brink of bankruptcy, burdened by substantial debts to France, Great Britain, and Spain. With the treasury empty, Juarez ordered that all payments on these debts be suspended for 2 years, hoping this grace period would enable the government to stabilize and generate the necessary funds to resume payments. Disturbed by the recent developments, delegates from France, Great Britain, and Spain met in London in 1861 and signed the Convention of London, which outlined their agreement to launch a joint military expedition aimed at seizing control of Mexico's ports to force the country to repay its debts. They were resolute in their commitment not to interfere in Mexico's internal affairs, seek territorial gains, or violate the rights of citizens. However, the delegates were unaware that the Emperor of France, Napoleon III, had independent ambitions for Mexico. The European alliance's fleets reached Veracruz in December 1861, followed by a French army in March 1862. Now, once Britain and Spain realized that Napoleon's true objective was to establish French dominance in Mexico rather than merely ensure the repayment of debts, they promptly withdrew their troops, leaving the French to pursue their conquest alone. Napoleon III aimed to exploit the suspension of payments as a pretext to invade Mexico and secure a foothold for France in the region. Like Mexico, France was a Catholic nation, and Napoleon III envisioned the establishment of a coalition of Catholic countries in the Americas to counter the growing influence of Anglo-Saxon Protestantism in the United States. On a personal level, having faced several diplomatic setbacks in Europe, he hoped that a successful campaign in Mexico would restore some prestige to his rule. And the conditions were favorable for an invasion. Mexico was financially bankrupt and politically fragmented. The liberal government's anti-clerical reforms had sparked a civil war. Napoleon believed that the conservative faction in Mexico would welcome the removal of the liberal government by a pro-Catholic power, even if it were foreign. The American Civil War had diverted US attention and resources, so Napoleon III was confident that he would not face American interference on behalf of the Juarez government despite the Monroe Doctrine. In 1862, the French suffered a humiliating defeat against a significantly smaller Mexican force at the famous Battle of Puebla, but the French managed to advance into central Mexico. I have a separate video on the Battle of Puebla and Cinco de Mayo. Please watch that video as well. You'll find the link in the description box below. Now, within 2 years, the French took control of Mexico City. Now, with a formidable military presence in Mexico, Napoleon III sought to establish a monarchy in Mexico and appointed Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph of Austria as the Emperor of Mexico. Napoleon misled Maximilian into believing that a vote had been conducted affirming his approval by the Mexican people. Now, that was a false claim. Maximilian and his wife Carlota relocated, convinced of their welcome. Maximilian was officially crowned emperor on April 10, 1864, marking the beginning of the Second Mexican Empire. Now, for context, the First Mexican Empire existed between 1821 and 1823 during the reign of Agustín de Iturbide following Mexico's independence from Spain. President Juarez and the Mexican government were forced to retreat to the northern border with the United States. On a side note, while Benito Juárez lived in Villa Paso del Norte, which is present-day Ciudad Juárez, in 1865-1866, he initiated a formal complaint to the US government requesting a resolution to the boundary dispute that would become known as the Chamizal problem. Nearly 100 years after his request, President Johnson and President Adolfo López Mateos celebrated the successful and peaceful settlement of this dispute. And here's a clip from a video made by the National Park Service about the Chamizal dispute.
For hundreds of miles, the Rio Grande separates the United States and Mexico, forming the international border. And for a century, the changing course of that river was the cause of international disagreements. In the mid-19th century, a dispute arose concerning a section of privately owned farmland between the settlements that grew into El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. Beginning in 1895, Mexico laid formal claim to the tract of land that became known as the Chamizal. The Mexican claim led to counterclaims by the United States, and over the years the dispute became a major impasse. This led to prolonged negotiation, arbitration, and further disagreement in the first half of the 20th century. By this time, Chamizal had grown into an international issue that strained diplomatic relations. Compounding the already complex issue was the tract of land known as Cordova Island, a detached part of Mexico on the north side of the Rio Grande, which adjoined the Chamizal tract. With the title to Chamizal disputed and Mexico's Cordova Island protruding into El Paso, the situation demanded resolution. In 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy and Mexico's President Adolfo López Mateos moved to break the deadlock. A plan was developed to construct a new concrete-lined channel for the Rio Grande that would bisect Chamizal and Cordova. All land south of the channel would go to Mexico, and the land to the north would go to the United States. After Kennedy's death in 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson completed negotiations which resulted in the Chamizal Treaty of 1963. The final agreement was signed in 1967, and water was diverted into the new channel the following year. It was not just parcels of land that were affected by the treaty. About 5,000 residents of El Paso, who had occupied the disputed territory, were forced to relocate, along with businesses and industries. The U.S. Congress set aside a portion of the land acquired from Mexico as Chamizal National Memorial. Here, the National Park Service presents activities that celebrate the cultural traditions of the people who share the borderlands, and we commemorate the peaceful settlement of a long-standing border dispute.
Though Lincoln and Juarez never met in person, their ideals and lives are connected in our collective memory of the events that shook North America in the 1860s. Now let's continue with the topic of French intervention. In 1867, the French Empire ultimately fell. The liberal forces captured Maximilian and his principal Mexican supporters in Querétaro. In June 1867, Juarez ordered the execution of the emperor, disregarding international calls for clemency. Juarez was a staunch legalist and refused to overturn the court-martial. He wanted the execution to serve as a warning to other foreign conquerors. In 1867, the Mexican people once again elected Juarez as president. His government constructed railroads and schools and reduced the military budget. He established a rural police force called the Rurales. The church was divested of its extensive land holdings. Most important, Mexico established its first effective government grounded in the Constitution of 1857, which ensured free speech, a free press, the right to assembly, and the abolition of fueros. On the downside, Juarez was unwilling to delegate authority and, despite significant opposition, insisted on his re-election in 1871. He genuinely believed that he alone could effectively govern Mexico. However, many began to view him as a dictator. Under Juarez, Mexico defaulted on its loan payments, and this made foreign investors hesitant to invest in Mexico. Meanwhile, lumber, sisal, and coffee emerged as significant exports. Juarez died from a heart attack in July 1872, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada, succeeded him as the next president until 1876, when he was overthrown by Porfirio Díaz. La Reforma ended during the Porfiriato. The Catholic Church reclaimed much of its authority, and Porfirio Díaz actively embraced foreign investment in both land and industry. By the beginning of the 20th century, a significant portion of Mexico's economy was controlled by foreign firms. Thank you.